welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into something fundamental about how organizations work, or sometimes how they break down. We often think about ethical failures as, just a few bad apples.
Right, the lone wolf explanation.
Exactly. But we're pushing past that. We're exploring the idea that ethics isn't just personal choice. It's deeply shaped by the organizational environment itself, the culture.
That's precisely the core of our deep dive today. We want to analyze how an organization's whole climate, everything from its official rulebooks and procedures to the powerful unwritten rules and expectations, how these things either line up to support ethical behavior
Or don't.
or, crucially, how they misalign. And when that happens, you often see these catastrophic institutional failures. Understanding this alignment or lack thereof is just foundational if you're trying to build an organization that people can actually trust.
And we've got some really substantial source material to guide us through this. We're leaning heavily on the work of Linda K. Trevino and Catherine A. Nelson. Specifically, they're thinking on ethics as organizational culture. It's a cornerstone piece.
It really is. And we're taking that framework and applying it to two, well, frankly, difficult case studies of crisis within the United States military. First, the infamous Tailhook 91 and the U.S. Navy case.
A major scandal.
Major scandal. And second, a more recent but equally critical document, the report of the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee. By looking at these together through the lens of Trevino and Nelson, we really hope to understand that critical, sometimes devastating link between the command climate and an organization's integrity.
So the big idea from Trevino and Nelson is that ethics isn't some kind of vague ideal floating around. It's actually a specific, almost measurable slice of the bigger organizational culture.
Exactly. It's not separate. If you want to change behavior, you can't just, give a speech. You have to look at the whole system. Ethical culture is built and sustained by this complex mix of formal systems, the stuff you can see and read, and the informal systems, the way things really work.
Like streams flowing into a river you mentioned before we started.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Every part of the organization, training manuals, water cooler gossip, promotion decisions, the stories people tell, they're all feeding into this main current. If some streams are polluted, the whole river gets tainted. And critically, if some streams are saying go left and others are saying go right,
people get confused. Or worse, cynical.
Precisely. They'll often just ignore the official map, the clean water, and follow the strongest current, even if it's heading in the wrong direction.
Okay, so if ethics is this slice of culture, let's peel it back. Where do we start? What are the visible parts, the formal systems you mentioned?
Right, the formal systems. These are the tangible things, the written structures and policies that are supposed to guide how people behave. It really starts at the very top.
Executive leadership.
Yes. Executive leader communications, the official mission statement, the list of company values, these all tell employees, at least on paper, what the organization claims it stands for.
But claims can be cheap. How does that translate into action? Does it start with who gets hired?
It absolutely has to. So formal systems include things like the selection process. Are you screening for integrity? Then orientation and training programs like, the mandatory ethics training everyone loves.
Laughs slightly.
Yeah.
Like the check the box exercise.
Well, that's the danger, isn't it? Is it just checking a box, or does that training actually give people skills, shape conversations, make ethics a real consideration from day one? And this connects directly to the written expectations, the actual rules, the policies, the codes of conduct.
The employee handbook stuff.
Yeah, detailing everything from, say, rules about accepting gifts to conflicts of interest to procedures for reporting concerns, very concrete things.
Okay, but we've all seen organizations with thick codes of conduct where things still go wrong. How does leadership make sure that code is actually, lived, not just gathering dust on a shelf?
Now you're hitting on probably the most powerful formal system, performance management.
How people are evaluated and rewarded.
Exactly. This is the ultimate truth teller inside an organization. What actually gets measured? What gets rewarded? What gets punished? That sends the loudest signal about what the organization really values, regardless of what the mission statement says.
So if the code preaches safety, but the manager who cuts corners on safety protocols to boost production numbers gets the big bonus,
then the reward system has just defined the real ethical standard. Safety isn't actually the priority. Hitting the numbers is. The code becomes wallpaper.
And it's not just rewards, is it? The actual structure of the organization matters too. How it's set up.
Oh, it's vital. Is the structure hierarchical and rigid, demanding unquestioning obedience? Or is it designed to encourage individual responsibility, accountability? And crucially, does it allow people to question authority, to raise concerns without fear?
The source material mentions this interesting analogy, something about Velcro.
Yes. That was a great example from one manager. The idea of responsibility sticking to you like Velcro.
What does that mean in practice? Is it a formal tracking thing?
It starts as a cultural expectation, maybe an informal norm, but it needs formal backing. The manager's point was, if you become aware of a problem, it's yours. It's stuck to you like Velcro until you make sure it's addressed.
So you can't just pass the buck.
Right. It implies that organizational structure must empower you, maybe even require you, to follow up, to escalate if necessary, regardless of whose job it officially is or who might be involved. Companies like Herman Miller, the furniture maker, are cited as examples where the structure explicitly encourages employees to raise issues, even several levels up, without fear.
That feels like the opposite of a structure that silences dissent.
It is. A structure that punishes people for speaking up or makes it impossible to question decisions is inherently dangerous from an ethical standpoint. It practically guarantees problems will fester.
Okay, one last piece of this formal puzzle seems critical. How does ethics actually get woven into the day-to-day decisions? Not just the big scandals, but the regular business choices.
Yeah, it can't be an afterthought. Ethical considerations need to be a formal, required part of major decision-making processes. For example, when managers propose a new project or product, are they formally required to analyze potential harm
Harm to whom?
to multiple stakeholders?
Yeah.
Not just the bottom line, the community, the environment, employees, future users. It needs to be built into the proposal template, the review process. Otherwise, it gets ignored when things get busy.
And the source material gives a really chilling example of how this can go wrong structurally. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster.
Yes, a terribly painful example. It wasn't just a case of being rushed, it was how the actual decision-making process was manipulated under pressure.
Explain that. What happened in that final meeting?
Well, as you know, there was immense pressure to launch. The engineers were raising serious concerns about the cold temperatures and the O-rings. They were operating under the previous established process where they had to prove the launch was safe.
That seems like the right default. Burden of proof on safety.
It should be. But in that high-pressure pre-launch meeting, management effectively flipped the script. They shifted the burden of proof. Suddenly, the engineers were being asked to definitively prove that the launch was unsafe.
Which, given the unprecedented cold, they couldn't do instantly.
Exactly. It was an impossible standard to meet on the spot. It structurally guaranteed the launch would proceed because it silenced the dissenting expert voice by changing the rules of the decision process itself.
Wow. That's subtle, but incredibly unethical. Shifting the burden of proof to enable a desired outcome.
It perfectly illustrates how a formal system, the launch approval process, can be twisted, not necessarily broken, but bent, to reinforce a predetermined, in that case tragic, decision. It puts schedule and pressure above safety by rigging the decision framework.
Okay, that really highlights the formal side. But you said the informal systems are often even more powerful. If the formal systems are the written rules, what are the informal ones, the unwritten ones?
Ah, the informal systems. This is the cultural bloodstream. This is where you find the real rules, the lived reality of the organization. They're incredibly powerful because they reflect what employees see and experience every single day.
So what forms do these take?
They're carried through the grapevine, the unofficial channels. They include things like organizational heroes and role models. These could be founders, legendary figures.
Yeah.
Think about the University of Virginia example in the source.
Where they ask, what would Mr. Jefferson do?
Exactly. Even centuries later, the stories and perceived values of a founder act as an informal guide for current decisions. Or it could be contemporary heroes who get celebrated. Who do people look up to?
And then there are the everyday things.
Absolutely. The norms of daily behavior are huge. How do senior managers actually treat junior staff or customers, especially when things are stressful? How are mistakes handled? Is it blame and punishment or learning? Is the environment defined by fear or by respect?
Rituals, too.
Like office parties?
Yes, rituals, myths, stories. The annual awards dinner, for example, who gets the awards, what accomplishments are being highlighted. That tells you more about what's valued than the official criteria might. Company history, the stories told about past crises or successes. These all shape the present.
Even language.
Language is incredibly potent. Think about jargon, slang, the way people talk about work. If a new accountant joins a firm and their supervisor says something like, you're a bit too honest to be a really effective auditor here, well,
That's a powerful message. It's an incredibly powerful, informal message that completely redefines the ethical expectations for that role, regardless of what the official training said.
this leads us straight to that critical idea you raised earlier, alignment. Why is it so damaging, so potentially fatal, when these formal systems, the written rules, clash with the informal systems, the lived reality?
Because misalignment breeds cynicism instantly. It makes the formal systems look like a complete joke, a mere facade. Employees aren't stupid. They watch what actually happens, what gets rewarded, who gets promoted, how people are really treated. They watch the informal system.
So if the ethics code has strict rules about accepting gifts,
But everyone knows a top executive regularly takes lavish trips paid for by a major vendor and nothing happens.
then the executive's behavior becomes the actual policy.
Precisely. The informal action completely overrides the formal rule. People pay attention to the action, the lived reality, not the dusty code of conduct.
So the company might have a glossy value statement talking about honesty and integrity, but then it gives the Salesperson of the Year award to someone everyone knows uses deceptive, high-pressure tactics to close deals.
Perfect example. In that case, the reward system, which is technically a formal system, has become perfectly aligned with an unethical, informal norm. The message is crystal clear. We say we value honesty, but we reward deception if it brings in revenue.
And employees learn fast.
They learn very fast. They'll ignore the value statement and model the rewarded behavior because that's how you succeed in the real culture. So, cultures can range from strongly aligned and ethical, where everything reinforces integrity, all the way to strongly aligned but unethical, where all systems, formal and informal, actually support and encourage bad behavior.
And what's really striking is that the source material suggests that employee perceptions of these informal systems often have a bigger impact on their ethical choices than the formal rules do.
Yes, and that really speaks to the power of the social environment, doesn't it? If the formal system is like the written law, the informal system is like the local custom or the street smarts. When they conflict, people tend to default to the custom, the lived experience.
And a huge part of that lived experience comes down to fairness.
Absolutely. Fairness might sound like a soft, fuzzy concept, but Trevino and Nelson argue it's foundational to workplace ethics.
How does that work? How does feeling treated fairly make someone act more ethically?
It's basically about social exchange, about reciprocity. If employees feel the organization treats them fairly, gives them a fair shake, they're more likely to reciprocate by treating the organization fairly, by acting ethically.
And fairness isn't just about pay, is it?
No, not at all. That's fairness in outcomes. But equally important is fairness in processes or decisions made in a way that's transparent, consistent, unbiased. And fairness in interactions are managers treating employees with dignity and respect day to day.
So if people feel the procedures are rigged, or if their boss constantly belittles them,
Then they feel the organization is fundamentally unfair. And that makes it much easier for them to rationalize unethical behavior against the organization. Things like, minor theft, fudging expense reports, padding hours. They see it as getting even or taking what they deserve from an unfair system.
that really paints a holistic picture of culture, which sets us up perfectly to talk about leadership's role. Let's shift focus now. How does a leader actively cultivate an ethical culture? Trevino and Nelson talk about two dimensions of ethical leadership.
Yes, this is a really critical distinction they make. An ethical leadership reputation, they argue, isn't just one thing. It rests on two distinct pillars: being a moral person and being a moral manager.
Okay, let's break those down. Moral person sounds pretty straightforward.
It's the foundation. It's the ethical part of the reputation. It's about the leader's personal traits. Are they seen as having integrity, being honest, trustworthy? Are they perceived as, squeaky clean? Do they walk the talk in their own behavior?
So this tells employees about the leader's own character.
Exactly. It tells employees how the leader is likely to behave personally when faced with an ethical choice. They live their values openly.
But just being a good person, a moral individual, that's not enough to shape the whole organization's ethics, right?
Absolutely not, and that's a trap. Many leaders are decent people, they have personal integrity, but they fail on the second dimension. Being a moral person is necessary, but it's not sufficient.
So what's the other dimension? The moral manager.
Right. This is the leadership part. Being a moral manager is about actively making ethics and values a visible priority for everyone else. It's about using your leadership platform to shape the ethical conduct of the organization. This dimension tells employees how the leader expects them to behave.
Okay, how does a leader do that? Especially when everyone's focused on hitting targets, meeting deadlines. The bottom line.
They have to be very intentional about it and visible. Think about it.
Mhm.
Most communication employees get is about operations, targets, performance metrics. So the moral manager has to consciously carve out space for ethics several ways. Being a visible role model, obviously championing ethical conduct, but also explicitly communicating about ethics and values regularly, openly, not just once a year. And crucially, using the reward system to reinforce ethical standards.
Back to performance management.
Always back to performance management. It means holding people accountable, everyone accountable, even the top performers, if they cross ethical lines. If the star salesperson gets a pass on shady behavior, the message is clear. Ethics doesn't really matter for the important people. Accountability has to be consistent.
So it's not passive. You can't just be good. You have to actively manage the moral climate.
That's the core idea. It requires deliberate action, constant communication, and aligning those powerful formal systems, especially rewards and accountability. It's what Thomas Neff and James Citron called live with integrity, lead by example. They found it was the #1 trait of star executives because integrity builds the trust needed for high performance.
And we have a pretty stark example in the source material of what happens when a leader does the opposite, when they actively manage for unethical behavior.
Yes, the case of Albert Dunlap at Sunbeam, Chainsaw Al. It's a classic example of a leader creating a strongly aligned but deeply toxic and unethical culture.
What do you do?
His message was simple: make the numbers at all costs. He offered huge rewards for hitting targets, but he encouraged, even demanded, deeply unethical practices to get there. He lied to Wall Street analysts. He pushed his managers to use accounting tricks like channel stuffing.
Who's channel stuffing?
It's basically forcing more inventory onto your distributors and retailers than they actually need or can sell, just so you can book it as revenue at the end of a quarter and make your numbers look good. It's deceptive, inflates sales figures fraudulently.
So, in Dunlap's Sunbeam, the formal system rewards and compensation was perfectly aligned with the informal expectation that you had to cheat to succeed.
Perfectly aligned for unethical outcomes. Deception wasn't just tolerated, it was implicitly required if you wanted those big rewards. And the result? Massive accounting fraud that eventually crippled the company.
Lost his job, right?
Oh yeah. Dunlap was fired, faced lawsuits from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and was ultimately barred from ever serving as an officer or director of a public company again. It shows very clearly, if the leader rewards unethical behavior, the organization will align itself to deliver that behavior, often with devastating consequences.
We've seen how a single leader can corrupt a company's ethical alignment. But what happens when this kind of systemic failure, this misalignment, takes root in a huge, complex institution like the United States military?
Let's shift to our first major case study, the Tailhook 91 scandal in the Navy.
Tailhook is just a gut-wrenching example of how a powerful, deeply embedded informal culture can completely steamroll an organization's formal ethical standards and compliance systems. And it happened during a time when the Navy itself was under immense stress.
What was going on in the Navy back then, around 1991? What was the backdrop?
It was a period of huge upheaval and uncertainty for the Navy. The Cold War had just ended, so their primary mission for decades was suddenly gone, leading to massive budget cuts, personnel reductions, base closures, a real identity crisis.
An identity crisis, exactly. On top of that, they were dealing with major changes in gender roles. Congress was pushing to allow women into combat aviation roles, which was a huge cultural shift, especially for the very tight-knit, traditionally male community of naval aviators.
The source describes them as needing to be crazy and cocky to do their job.
Yes. Landing high-performance jets on a moving ship in the middle of the ocean. It breeds a certain culture, high risk, intense camaraderie, maybe a sense of being separate, elite. So you had mission uncertainty, budget cuts, and social change all hitting this community at once.
And this tension seemed to boil over at the Tailhook Association's annual symposium in Las Vegas. What did the informal culture look like there?
Well, the symposium was supposed to be a professional gathering, panels, networking, but informally, it was infamous for its wild, alcohol-fueled parties, especially in the hospitality suites hosted by various squadrons on the third floor of the Las Vegas Hilton.
The source mentions a staggering amount spent on alcohol.
Over $35,000 just for that weekend. A lot of it paid for privately by the squadrons. It wasn't just social drinking, it fueled an atmosphere of, frankly, debauchery.
And the physical damage was just accepted.
It became routine, part of the ritual. After the '91 event, the association had to pay the hotel $23,000 for damages, mostly replacing ruined carpets on that third floor from spills, burns, you name it. Apparently, a board member had even warned years before that these excessive drinking rituals were creating walking zombies and undermining the organization's integrity.
But the warning was ignored.
Formally ignored. The informal ritual was stronger. Which brings us to the most notorious ritual of Tailhook 91, the gauntlet.
Describe what that was.
The gauntlet was this. This organized, ritualistic form of mass sexual harassment and assault. Large groups of men, mostly junior officers, would line the hallway on the third floor. As women, and sometimes men too, tried to walk down the hall, they would be grabbed, groped, pinched, manhandled, sometimes passed down the line.
It wasn't random.
No, it was a known, almost expected part of the symposium's informal culture. A horrific ritual. One witness described it vividly, saying it looked like a pinball machine, with each man in the line getting his shot in. Just incredibly dehumanizing.
And Lieutenant Paula Coughlin, a Navy helicopter pilot, was one of the victims. She reported being assaulted in the gauntlet. How did the Navy's formal system respond when she came forward?
The initial response was a catastrophic failure of the formal systems, and it failed largely because the informal culture immediately circled the wagons to protect itself.
What happened?
The Secretary of the Navy at the time, H. Lawrence Garrett III, did order official investigations, 2 of them actually, one by the Naval Investigative Service and another by the Naval Inspector General.
So the formal investigative mechanisms were activated.
They were activated, yes, but they were deeply, fatally flawed from the outset. They completely failed to grasp the scale of the problem. Initially, they only identified 2 alleged assailants out of potentially hundreds involved in the gauntlet and other incidents.
Why so few?
The reports pointed to a massive failure of leadership and a lack of moral courage among officers who either witnessed things and did nothing, or who actively stonewalled the investigators. There was a collective refusal to cooperate.
Was there something in the informal culture that specifically encouraged that stonewalling?
Yes. The source material explicitly mentions the powerful influence of informal groups like the so-called Lieutenants Protective Association or Junior Officers Protective Association.
What were those?
They weren't official organizations, but represented this deep, unwritten code of allegiance among junior officers. You don't rat out another officer, especially not for doing something stupid while drunk or off-duty. It was loyalty to the group above loyalty to the Navy's rules or ethical standards.
So that informal code, don't snitch on your buddies, completely undermined the formal investigation.
Completely. The allegiance to the informal group norm was stronger than the formal duty to report misconduct and cooperate with investigators. It's a perfect example of informal culture overriding formal compliance.
Things got so bad the Department of Defense had to step in.
Yes, Secretary Garrett eventually realized the Navy had lost all credibility to investigate itself. He had to ask the Department of Defense Inspector General to take over and conduct a third, much more thorough investigation.
And what did that investigation find?
The Department of Defense report was scathing. It identified 140 officers for potential disciplinary action related to assault or indecent exposure, or for lying to investigators. And significantly, it concluded that the rampant misconduct was allowed to continue by the leadership, both within the aviation community and the Tailhook Association itself.
So leadership failure, the moral manager dimension we talked about.
Exactly. The failure wasn't just the actions of junior officers, it was the failure of senior leaders to set and enforce an ethical climate where such behavior was unthinkable and would be immediately stopped and reported.
And the consequences reached the very top.
They did. The report led directly to Secretary Garrett resigning. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Frank Kelso, was also implicated and eventually allowed to retire early, though his role remained controversial. It showed that accountability, when finally enforced, had to go all the way up. Leaders are responsible for the climate they create or tolerate.
But even then, the justice process itself seemed to break down.
Yes, that was perhaps the final, crushing blow to confidence. The few court-martial cases that actually went forward eventually collapsed. Why? Because Admiral Kelso himself, the Chief of Naval Operations, had been present at the Tailhook Convention.
He was there.
He was there, and reportedly witnessed some lewd behavior, though he denied seeing the assaults. But his presence, and later actions related to the investigations led to accusations that he had exerted unlawful command influence over the prosecution process.
Meaning he tried to sway the outcomes.
That was the accusation. A military judge eventually agreed it created an appearance of impropriety and dismissed the remaining charges against the accused aviators. It completely torpedoed the military justice process in this case and cemented the perception of an institution unable or unwilling to hold its own accountable.
Tailhook really stands as this stark historical marker, an entrenched informal culture hidden from view that ultimately shattered the formal systems when exposed. Let's fast forward now, though, to a more recent and perhaps more structurally focused breakdown the findings of the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee. This looks specifically at the failures of the Army's Sexual Harassment Assault Response and Prevention Program.
Yes, the Fort Hood report is crucial because it digs deep into the structural design failures and misalignment that crippled a program specifically created to address ethical failures, like sexual harassment and assault. It shows it's not just about attitudes, but about how the system itself is built.
And the committee found, right off the bat, a profound lack of confidence in the program among soldiers at Fort Hood.
Absolutely pervasive lack of confidence, and the root cause was depressingly familiar. The informal culture, the command climate, prioritized mission readiness above everything else. The Sexual Harassment Assault Response and Prevention Program, or SHARP as it's often called.
Let's stick with the full name for clarity.
Right. The Sexual Harassment Assault Response and Prevention Program was widely viewed, informally, as a distraction. A perfunctory task, as the report says, something that got in the way of training and deployment, not as a critical program for soldier welfare and unit cohesion.
And this informal message had real consequences for reporting.
Massive consequences. Victims didn't report because they knew from the informal culture that they would likely face negative repercussions: ostracism, shunning, being labeled a troublemaker, career damage. The report found 28% of women surveyed specifically feared being ostracized if they filed a sexual harassment complaint. They saw what happened to others.
There were even reports of leaders preying on subordinates.
Yes, numerous reports of non-commissioned officers, people in positions of trust, preying on their subordinates, which further chilled reporting and destroyed trust in the system designed to protect them.
And this informal devaluation of the program was reflected in a key structural flaw: who was actually assigned to run it.
Exactly. This is a critical finding about the failure of the formal system of personnel assignment and training. The report found that the sexual harassment assault response coordinators and the victim advocates at the unit level, the frontline people, were often not the best qualified individuals.
Why not?
Because they were typically assigned by local commanders as an additional duty. It wasn't their primary job. Often, commanders would assign non-commissioned officers who were seen as, quote, expendable, or perhaps less critical to the unit's operational mission.
So not the high flyers.
Generally not. Which meant these crucial roles were often filled by people without adequate specialized training, without enough dedicated time to do the job properly, and without the perceived authority or backing from command. One coordinator even told the committee that senior commanders viewed the program as pointless.
That structure itself sends a powerful negative message.
A devastating message. The review committee concluded that this fundamental structural flaw, relying on borrowed, often underqualified, temporary manpower instead of creating a dedicated professional cadre, was a primary reason for the program's ineffectiveness.
Okay, let's dig into some other structural problems the committee found. Applying that formal systems lens we discussed earlier, where were the bottlenecks in actually investigating reported crimes?
The breakdown was systemic, but a major choke point was the Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, the unit responsible for investigating felony crimes, including sexual assault. The Fort Hood detachment was found to be in dire straits.
How so?
Unstable leadership, chronic understaffing, and most critically, overwhelming inexperience. An incredible 92% of the enlisted agents assigned to the Fort Hood detachment were classified as apprentice agents.
Meaning they were brand new.
Essentially, yes. Straight out of basic agent training, not yet fully accredited to lead complex investigations independently. You had trainees investigating incredibly sensitive, complex crimes like sexual assault, often involving traumatized victims and requiring sophisticated techniques like search warrants and digital forensics.
That's a recipe for disaster.
It guarantees failure. And the results showed it. Investigations dragged on interminably. The average time to complete a sex crime investigation at Fort Hood was 215 days.
Months and months.
Months and months, among the slowest of comparable Army posts. Victims lost faith, Perpetrators often remained in the unit, witnesses moved on, evidence degraded. Many victims or even subjects would transfer or leave the Army entirely before an investigation concluded, undermining any sense of justice or deterrence.
Was it just inexperience or resources too?
Both. The unit was severely under-resourced. Based on workload analysis, they needed about 45 special agents. At times, their actual staffing was less than half that. They simply didn't have the people or the experience to handle the caseload effectively. The formal system of resource allocation failed to meet the ethical demand.
And the problems didn't stop with the investigation, did they? There were issues with tracking cases and supporting victims too.
Right. Another major structural gap was the lack of accountability in tracking cases through the entire process. No single person or entity was responsible for monitoring how long a case sat at each stage: reporting, investigation, legal review, adjudication.
So no one could see where the delays were happening.
Exactly. Without tracking the life cycle, you can't identify the bottlenecks, you can't hold anyone accountable for fixing them. And this lack of transparency fed the feeling among victims that their cases just disappeared into a black hole. They frequently reported not being kept informed about the status or outcome, which, understandably, led to that profound loss of confidence.
Victim support was also strained.
Critically strained. Fort Hood, despite its size and the volume of cases, only had 4 dedicated Special Victims Council attorneys available to represent victims during the military justice process.
Only 4.
Only 4. This created huge backlogs. A court-martial can't proceed if the victim wants representation from a Special Victims Council and one isn't available. The report cited anecdotal evidence of delays up to 3 weeks just to get a counsel assigned, grinding the already slow process to a halt. Again, a formal system victim support was structurally under-resourced to meet the need.
The overall command climate described in the report sounds almost toxic regarding safety and well-being.
It sounds deeply problematic. Soldiers reported feeling unsafe on post. Some even made the shocking statement they felt safer in Afghanistan than at Fort Hood because of the pervasive crime and the perception that leadership wasn't taking proactive steps to address it.
Why not?
The overwhelming focus, again, was on mission readiness, operational tempo, soldier health, safety, welfare. These were treated as secondary concerns, things to be managed around, rather than foundational to readiness itself. There was a devastating quote in the report from soldiers who claimed, "If we lose a piece of equipment, the whole base is locked down, but if we lose a soldier, nothing happens."
Wow. That says everything about the informal value system, doesn't it? Equipment over people.
It starkly reveals the perceived priorities, the informal truth of that command climate, completely misaligned with stated Army values about caring for soldiers.
Given this deep systemic misalignment, what did the review committee recommend? They must have proposed some major changes.
They did, and their key recommendations went right at the structural heart of the problem, aiming to break that cycle of local command priorities undermining the sexual harassment assault response and prevention program.
What was the main structural fix?
The most significant recommendation was to move the entire program structure outside the direct authority of the local installation or unit command chain. They suggested modeling it after other independent Army organizations like the Trial Defense Service or the Combat Readiness Center.
Why is taking it out of the local command chain so important?
Because it ensures objectivity and insulation from local mission pressures. It protects the integrity of the program. If the people running the program report up a separate, dedicated chain focused solely on sexual assault prevention and response, they're less likely to have their efforts sidelined or resources diverted by local commanders focused only on the next deployment or training exercise.
And it builds trust.
It's designed to build trust. Soldiers might feel more confident reporting to an entity perceived as independent and objective, rather than reporting up their own chain where they fear bias or reprisal. The committee also recommended creating that dedicated professional cadre of program personnel, selected, trained, managed at the Department of the Army level, not locally appointed.
So professionalize the role and insulate the structure.
Exactly. Structural changes designed to force alignment between the stated ethical goals of the program and its actual operation on the ground.
This whole deep dive, looking at the theory and these two stark cases, really hammers home that initial point. Achieving ethical alignment isn't about tweaking one policy. It requires looking at all the systems, formal and informal, together.
Absolutely. The complexity of the ethical problem demands an equally complex, systemic solution. Trying to fix a deep cultural issue with a quick fix, like just rolling out a new ethics code or another mandatory training, is, frankly, ludicrous based on what Trevino and Nelson describe.
Why do those quick fixes fail?
Because they ignore the interplay of systems.
Yeah.
If an organization puts out a new code because of, say, bad press, but doesn't change the performance metrics that reward unethical shortcuts, or doesn't resource the compliance office properly, or doesn't hold leaders accountable, employees see right through it.
They see it as hypocrisy.
Profound hypocrisy. And that failure to follow through, that misalignment, just breeds more cynicism and reinforces the idea that the formal rules don't really matter.
And changing culture, especially in big, established organizations like the military or large corporations, faces enormous resistance, doesn't it?
Enormous resistance. There's a powerful force called cultural persistence, or inertia. Organizational scholars estimate that making deep, meaningful changes to an established culture can take a very long time, maybe 6 to 15 years. It's not a quick project.
Why is it so hard?
Because cultures tend to perpetuate themselves. Unethical cultures, for example, often unconsciously hire and promote people who fit the existing mold. People who won't rock the boat, think about the good old boys network implicit in the Tailhook case. They replicate their own dysfunction.
So if an organization is genuinely serious about improving its ethical culture, where does it even begin, beyond just writing new rules?
It has to start with a really honest, deep diagnosis. What Trevino and Nelson call an ethical culture audit. This isn't just a quick online survey.
What does it involve?
It's more time-consuming. It involves things like systematically collecting and analyzing the stories people tell, what anecdotes circulate, what do they reveal about real norms. It involves in-depth interviews, talking to people at all levels to understand their lived experience. It means rigorously examining the formal systems. Who really gets rewarded? What are the criteria?
To avoid generic solutions.
But exactly. To avoid those spray and pray solutions, the consultant's report that sits on the shelf, because it doesn't actually address the unique, specific ethical challenges and cultural realities of that particular organization, the diagnosis has to be tailored to build a solution that fits.
And throughout both the Tailhook and Fort Hood cases, we saw repeatedly that the informal system, the unwritten rules, the grapevine, the peer pressure, that's ultimately what dictated behavior, often more than the official regulations.
That is perhaps the single most critical takeaway. Employees will always believe the informal system, what they see happening around them, what gets punished or ignored, more than the formal system, the words in the handbook or the mission statement on the wall.
So failure to align actions with words is fatal.
It's interpreted immediately as hypocrisy, which is why the Fort Hood Review's recommendation to structurally isolate the sexual harassment assault response and prevention program was so insightful. It was an attempt to physically shield the formal ethical system from the powerful, often toxic, informal pressures of the local command climate. Sometimes you need that kind of radical structural surgery to break the grip of cultural inertia.
It really underscores that effective organizational leadership isn't just about managing tasks. It's about being a steward of the culture. And that means understanding and addressing the complexity.
It absolutely does. Which brings us maybe to a final thought for our listeners to consider. If we accept that these informal systems, the heroes, the stories, the daily norms, are truly the most powerful drivers of ethical or unethical behavior.
More powerful than the rule book, often.
Often, yes. Then the real ongoing challenge for any leader trying to be a moral manager is this. Beyond writing policies or giving speeches, what specific, concrete, daily actions can you take to actively shape and influence the stories that circulate on that organizational grapevine?
How do you manage the narrative?
How do you ensure the stories people tell celebrate integrity? Celebrate the courage it takes to speak up about a problem. How do you make those the heroic actions that get talked about around the water cooler instead of, say, celebrating the person who bent the rules to make a target? That constant, subtle management of informal culture, the symbolic actions, that's the really hard long-term work of building and sustaining an ethical organization.